Hello, thanks for joining us today. We analyze the Ukrainian crisis as seen from Brussels. Events in Ukraine have posed a formidable challenge to the European Union. Europe has tried to assert itself diplomatically and offer Kiev an alternative to Russia's domination. But within the EU, divisions, dependence on Russian gas, and the absence of a political vision for Ukraine have all blunted Europe's influence. Joining us from Berlin to talk about this is Michael Lee of the German Marshall Fund. He's a specialist on Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc, also a former Director General of Enlargement for the European Commission. Mr. Lee, first question to you. How much of a priority is Ukraine for Brussels today? One gets the impression when one looks at the way this crisis has unfolded that between Europe and Russia, it's really the one who cares about Ukraine most who manages to assert himself most. Is that accurate? Do you see that in Brussels?
In Brussels, there has been a strategy for Ukraine. Ever since 2008, the EU has been negotiating an extremely wide-ranging agreement with Ukraine. And in fact, as I'm sure you recall, it was differences over the signature of this agreement and Yanukovych's refusal, in fact, to sign it that led to the Maidan events and everything we're living through now. So Europe has been rather proactive on Ukraine. It's true that the member states do not have an appetite for any new members as such for the time being, but short of membership, the EU offered a very far-reaching partnership. But all this is somewhat economic, somewhat technical. For Mr. Putin, it's more an existential matter. He's enunciated a new doctrine, virtually of limited sovereignty for countries with large Russian-speaking minorities. And for him, this is not a question of economics or of integration. It's a fundamental Russian national interest.
So what does Europe want then? As you said, it's an existential matter for Russia. What's Europe trying to get out of having influence, asserting influence in Ukraine?
Europe's main vision has been to have a ring of well-governed democracies surrounding the European Union, whether to the east or to the south, as a guarantee of stability. Basically, we don't want problems of instability, flows of people, refugees, asylum seekers, criminal gangs spilling over from countries like Ukraine into neighboring regions of the European Union. We've seen it as in our own interest to introduce a policy that would strengthen democracy, the rule of law, and fight corruption and criminality in Ukraine, both for Ukraine's own benefit and to protect ourselves.
It's interesting that you should say that because, in fact, under the previous government in Ukraine, when Russia still had a very strong role to play in Ukraine and with the authorities in Kiev, I really don't see what the danger was for Europe. I don't see what danger the former Ukraine posed for Europe.
Well, you're seeing now what instability really means. You know, for years and years, we've talked about democracy, human rights, the rule of law, all these very sound principles, and we've contrasted them with instability, corruption, criminality, and so on. Well, now, these things that we warned against have actually become a reality. So it was to try and prevent these sorts of developments that Europe wanted to develop a close partnership with Ukraine. And it was the rejection of that partnership by Yanukovych that led to the events that we're seeing today.
So what leverage does Europe currently have in Ukraine? One sometimes gets the impression that Europe is not fighting with the same weapons as Moscow.
It's true that Moscow doesn't think twice about recourse to force. In fact, this is the first time since the end of the Cold War that we have seen borders in Europe being changed by the use of force. And the European Union, and indeed the United States, has ruled out from the very beginning the rule of force. We are trying to use other means. We're trying to strengthen democratic forces within Ukraine. We're trying to provide economic assistance that can shore up this very weak state that has some fundamental structural problems and economic problems. But at the same time, we are imposing sanctions together with the United States that shows Russia that there is a price to pay. But if you ask about the order of magnitude of the instruments that we're ready to use compared with Russia. It's true, we are using, if you like, postmodern instruments, while Russia is stuck back in the earlier part of the 20th century or even the late 19th century in its willingness to use force.
And so to put it simply, can postmodernism work against use of force?
I think we have to think again. And in particular, we have to consider how the European Union can work better side to side with NATO, which is, after all, fundamentally a military alliance. We have seen in the last days a great deal of nervousness by countries which are both NATO allies and EU members, countries like Poland, Estonia, Latvia, who are starting to wonder who might be next. And NATO has taken some rather strong measures in beefing up aerial patrols, in planning various exercises in these countries, which should send the message to Mr. Putin that if he tried to push his new doctrine into countries which are EU members and NATO allies, he could expect a much sharper response.
Is the crisis in Ukraine spurring renewed debate over a common European defense policy?
Certainly this is something which is receiving considerable attention in Brussels, and during the election campaign for the European Parliament in May, this is a perfect occasion for different candidates to put forward their different points of view on this. The fact of the matter is, though, for the moment, when it comes to problems in Europe, unlike peacekeeping operations or humanitarian operations in distant continents, the division of responsibility between NATO and the EU is pretty clear.
Mr. Lee, if we look back to Georgia, which I think is a good example or a good framework at least to understand what's going on in Ukraine, at the time of the Russia-Georgia war, that was 6 years ago in 2008, Europe intervened and obtained, officially at least, a ceasefire. But 6 years on, what you see is that South Ossetia, which was at the center of that conflict, South Ossetia is essentially administered by Russia. People there not only speak Russian, have a Russian passport, and use Russian currency, but to all intents and purposes, South Ossetia is no longer a part of Georgia and is a part of Russia. Has Europe learned any lessons from that conflict?
I think you'll see now that the European neighbourhood policy, which has governed our approach to these countries in the past, is going to be subject to serious review. After the elections to the European Parliament in May, there'll be a new foreign policy chief for the EU, and I think one of the items that should be absolutely top of that person's agenda and on which that person should be interrogated during hearings in the European Parliament is a new vision, a new approach to our own neighbourhood that takes into account the very real threats that we've seen over the last few weeks.
One of the factors that weighs particularly heavily in Europe's diplomacy and Europe's stance vis-à-vis Russia, of course, is the dependence of a large number of European countries on Russian gas. That issue had already been brought up 6 years ago when we were discussing Europe's response to the Georgian crisis. Again, have any lessons been learned? Has Europe done anything to lessen its dependence on Russian gas?
As always, we have a strategy. I won't say the strategy remains entirely on paper. Various steps have been taken. As you know, the European Commission has taken some legal steps against Gazprom, for example, to try and challenge its monopolistic position as both a supplier of gas and owner of networks. But obviously, we need to do much more. We need to be in a position to diversify both the different sorts of energy we use, gas, oil, renewables, nuclear energy, and also to diversify the geographic sources of that energy. To do this effectively, we need to have better interconnectors between different parts of our network in Europe so we can switch quickly to different sources of supply. And we need to increase the supplies from existing exporters of gas to the European Union, like Norway, Algeria, and Qatar. And we have to look into new sources of supply, such as the Eastern Mediterranean, and for that matter, the United States. At home,
and
I think the debate
Mr. Lee, is all of that happening? Because this is something that I remember was said 6 years ago during the Georgia crisis once again. Is it happening today? Are we exploring other avenues seriously?
We're exploring them, but obviously much greater urgency needs to be given to this. The vision is clear. We know what we have to do, but now is the time to get down to business.
And very briefly, Mr. Lee, what do you think Europe should propose to Ukraine? What is the political project or the political vision that Europe should be putting forward to authorities in Kiev?
Europe should and is putting forward to Kiev a vision of how a modern state can be run respecting the rule of law, without corruption at all levels of society, as has been the case until now. We can share with Ukraine some of the expertise we've gained, for example, during the enlargement process, about how best to fight corruption. What Ukraine really needs are free and fair elections in May, so that the new authorities that come to power are of unquestioned legitimacy. And those authorities need to put to their own electorate a clear vision of a democratic country that respects the rule of law and where corruption is not present at all levels of life. And the EU needs to be there and is there with a major program of assistance to bring this vision to reality.
All right, Mr. Lee, thanks for your analysis. Thanks for joining us on the France 24 interview from Berlin. We'll continue to follow developments on the Ukrainian crisis and Europe's position vis-à-vis Ukraine right here on France 24. Do stay tuned. More news coming up.